My brother stood up at our Thanksgiving table, lifted his crystal glass, and announced that Dad had secretly given him the company I built from scratch. Then he smiled at me and said I was getting nothing. My mother looked down at her plate. My sister-in-law looked at the chandelier like she was already spending my money. And my father, Richard, sat there like a king. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I only took a slow sip of vodka, looked straight at him, and asked, "Should I tell them now?" What they didn't know was already signed by me. People always think betrayal arrives loud. In my family, it usually came wrapped in polite smiles, expensive perfume, and someone saying, "Don't make this awkward." Ruby. My name is Ruby. I was 36 years old, the founder and CEO of a high-end organic cosmetics brand, and according to my family, I was still just the difficult daughter who made face creams in her kitchen. That was the joke they liked to tell. My father, Richard, loved saying it at dinners, especially when there were strangers around. He would lean back in his chair, swirl his drink, and say. Ruby always had a vivid imagination. Then he would laugh like my entire life was a cute little hobby that had gotten out of hand. My mother, Margaret, would smile softly beside him. She never corrected him. She never defended me. She would just touch her pearls and say, "She's always been independent." Independent. That was the word they used when they meant unsupported. My younger brother, Brandon, was different. Brandon was the golden boy. He was charming, polished, loud in the way people mistake for confidence. If he failed, he was taking risks. If I succeeded, I was lucky. If he needed help, it was family duty. If I needed help, it was poor planning. And Vanessa, Brandon's wife, fit into our family like she had been custom-made for its worst instincts. She wore white cashmere in other people's homes, inspected rooms like she was pricing them, and smiled only when money was being discussed. I used to think I could earn my way out of their contempt. I worked nights at an old diner in the city when I was 18. My uniform always smelled like burnt coffee, fryer grease, and bleach that never fully washed out. I kept my college savings in a separate account and checked the balance every Friday like it was a prayer. Then, 2 weeks before graduation, the money was gone. Richard told me he and Margaret had used it for Brandon's new sports car. He said my brother needed to look successful. Margaret said I was smart enough to figure college out on my own. I remember standing in our kitchen with my backpack still on one shoulder, staring at the framed family photo above the stove. Brandon was in the center, grinning. Richard's hand was on his shoulder. Margaret's smile was bright. I was on the edge of the picture, half shadowed by the hallway. That photo told the truth before anyone did. So I stopped asking. I studied contracts between shifts. I learned how businesses were protected, how ownership worked, how people hid knives behind signatures. Years later, when my little kitchen experiment turned into a real company, I built it carefully, quietly, legally, layer by layer. By the time Thanksgiving came, my family still believed I was the same girl they could take from, and that was exactly what I needed them to believe. The first warning came from my Aunt Linda, my mother's sister, who treated gossip like oxygen. She stopped by my office one rainy Tuesday, pretending she wanted lunch. I watched her eyes move over the shelves of glass jars, the shipping labels, the product samples lined up under soft white lights. She touched a box with 2 fingers and said, "Ruby, I had no idea this was so serious." That word bothered me. Serious. Not successful. Not impressive. Serious. Like she had discovered a secret weapon. 2 days later, Margaret called and asked how the little beauty business was doing. Then Richard asked whether my old company papers were still active. Brandon casually mentioned that family assets should stay in the family. Vanessa asked if large retailers paid up front or after delivery. None of them thought they sounded suspicious. They sounded desperate. By then, I already knew Brandon and Vanessa were drowning. Their investment fund had collapsed after a series of reckless bets. Their house was behind on payments. Their cars were leased. Their friends had stopped inviting them to dinners where checks were split evenly. But desperation does not make people humble. It makes entitled people dangerous. A week before Thanksgiving, Clara, my corporate lawyer and the only person who knew how deeply I had protected my business, called me while I was standing in my home office. "Someone is pulling records on the old operating company," she said. I looked out at the gray ocean beyond the windows. The water was rough that morning, hitting the rocks like it had a grudge. "Brandon," I asked. "Not directly," Clara said, "but close enough." I closed my eyes for 1 second. The old operating company was real, but it was not the heart of my business anymore. It handled certain logistics. That was it, the formulas, trademarks, contracts. And real value were held safely somewhere else, all legal, all documented, all built years before my family even cared. "Do you want me to stop them?" Clara asked. I looked down at the Thanksgiving menu on my desk. Turkey. "Sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, pecan pie." "No," I said quietly. "Let them keep going." Because for once, I did not want to explain the stove was hot. I wanted to see who was arrogant enough to touch it. Thanksgiving at my house looked perfect from the outside. The dining room smelled like roasted turkey, butter, sage, and expensive perfume. Candles flickered along the center of the long wooden table. The ocean wind tapped against the windows. Soft jazz played from the speakers. Low enough to feel polite, my family walked in already judging everything. Margaret, my mother, touched the banister and said, "This place is beautiful." Ruby, a little much for one person. Though, Richard, my father, went straight to the bar cart like he owned it. Brandon, my younger brother, wandered through the living room with his hands in his pockets, staring at the artwork. Vanessa, his wife, ran one manicured finger along the silverware and smiled like she was imagining it in her own drawer. They all believed I was renting the house. I let them. During dinner, Brandon talked over me twice. Richard corrected me about business margins in an industry he had never worked in. Margaret kept sighing about how hard things had been for Brandon lately. "He has so much pressure on him," she said, patting his hand. I looked at my brother's clean cuffs, his polished watch, the soft hands of a man who had never packed orders at 2 a.m. because rent was due. Vanessa leaned toward me and smiled. It must be nice. "Ruby, playing founder. Very inspiring." I smiled back. "It keeps me busy." She laughed through her nose. By dessert. The room had changed. I could feel it. Brandon kept looking at Richard. Richard kept checking his watch. Margaret folded and unfolded her napkin. Vanessa bounced one heel under the table so fast the crystal glasses trembled. Then Brandon stood. He tapped his knife against his glass. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound sliced through the jazz. "I have an announcement," he said. Nobody looked surprised except me. And even that was performance. Brandon buttoned his jacket, lifted his glass, and smiled down the table. "After serious conversations with Dad, we've decided Ruby's company needs real leadership." My fork rested beside the pecan pie. My hand did not move. He continued, louder now. "Dad has legally transferred the old operating company to Vanessa and me. Effective immediately, we control it." Margaret looked down at her plate. Richard leaned back, chest high, eyes shining with pride. Vanessa's smile spread slowly, like spilled wine. Brandon looked directly at me. "You built something cute." "Ruby, I'll give you that, but you're not cut out for scale. So here's what happens next. You cooperate. Hand over every password, and we might keep you on payroll. I heard the ocean hit the rocks outside." "As what I asked." He tilted his head, pretending to be generous. "Warehouse manager," he said. "Stable salary, less stress, and just so we're clear, you're getting nothing." The table went dead silent. Even the candles seemed to stop moving. And for the first time all night, Richard refused to meet my eyes. I looked at Brandon first, then Vanessa, then my mother. Finally, I looked at Richard. My father's face had changed. The pride was still there, but underneath it was something thinner. Nervousness. He had expected me to cry, maybe shout, maybe beg him to undo it. Instead, I reached for my vodka. The glass was cold against my fingers. The ice shifted once. A soft little clink in the silence. I took a slow sip, set it down carefully, and kept my eyes on Richard. Should I tell them now? I asked. Or do you want to Margaret's head snapped up? Brandon laughed, but it came out too sharp. Tell us what Richard's jaw tightened. That was the answer I needed. I reached beside my chair and lifted a slim tablet from my leather bag. I placed it on the table, right between the cranberry sauce and Vanessa's untouched pie. You want control? I said. Fine. Brandon blinked. I unlocked the screen and opened the transfer portal Clara had prepared. Clean, legal, simple enough for a greedy man to misunderstand. This confirms that you're accepting full administrative authority over the old operating company, I said. Banking alerts, vendor notices, logistics obligations, outstanding bills, everything. Vanessa leaned forward. So he gets access to the accounts. I smiled without showing my teeth. All active notices will go to him. That was all she needed to hear. Brandon reached for the tablet like it was a winning lottery ticket. Finally, a little cooperation. Read it first, I said. He gave me that same smirk he had worn since childhood, the one that said he believed rules were for other people. Ruby. I worked in finance. No, I said softly. You performed finance. His face darkened, but his pride was louder than his anger. He signed with his finger, fast and sloppy. Vanessa whispered, Do it, babe, like she was watching him cut a ribbon on a new mansion. The confirmation screen turned green. Richard exhaled. Margaret closed her eyes like the family had just been healed. Brandon leaned back and said, Send me the passwords by Monday. I slid the tablet back toward myself. They're already routed to your email, I said. He grinned, and that was the saddest part. He really thought the green checkmark meant victory. Across the room, the old clock above the fireplace ticked toward 7. I folded my napkin in my lap and waited, because some consequences do not need to be delivered. They arrive right on schedule, at exactly 7 o'clock. Brandon's phone buzzed against the table, not once, 3 times. The sound was small, but it hit the room like a dropped plate. Brandon glanced down, annoyed at first. He still had that lazy, victorious look on his face, like he was already imagining himself walking into my office on Monday and firing people who had built something he didn't understand. Then he opened the message. His smile disappeared. Vanessa noticed first. What is it? Brandon didn't answer. His thumb moved fast across the screen, refreshing, tapping, searching for some other number, some other explanation, anything that could make his face stop draining of color. What is it? Richard asked. Brandon looked up slowly. Why is there a payment notice for $150,000? The dining room went so quiet I could hear the wind scraping against the windows. Margaret's hand flew to her throat. Vanessa grabbed the phone from Brandon, read the screen, and whispered, That can't be right. It is right, I said. Brandon turned on me. What did you do? Nothing? I said. That's the point. You accepted full administrative authority. The banking notices, payments, bills, vendor alerts, and debt obligations all go to you now. Richard pushed his chair back. Ruby, don't start. I looked at him. No, Dad, I think this is exactly where we start. I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick legal folder. I placed it on the table. Right beside the turkey no one was eating anymore. This is the loan paperwork tied to the old operating company, I said. Around $6 million. Vanessa made a small choking sound. Brandon shook his head. No, that company has revenue. The old operating company had activity, I said. It handled logistics. It processed certain shipments. That made it look valuable if someone didn't understand the structure. Richard's eyes narrowed. You always did love making things complicated. No, I said. I learned to make things protected. I opened the folder and turned the first few pages toward Brandon. The monthly payment is about $150,000. It pulls automatically. That's the notice you just got. Brandon stared at the papers like they were written in another language. Vanessa looked at Richard. You knew about this. Richard's mouth opened, then closed. That was enough. I turned another page. Here are the payments. Here are the bills. Here are the transfers. A large portion of that loan never went into operations. Some of it went toward gambling debts. Some of it disappeared into private accounts. And about $800,000 went toward a vacation property that benefited Brandon. Brandon's chair scraped back. Dad. Richard slammed his palm on the table. I was going to fix it, with what I asked. More of my work. Margaret started crying then. But not the soft kind. It was the panicked kind. The sound people make when the world they helped build starts falling on them. Ruby, she whispered, please don't do this to your father. I almost laughed, but I didn't. You mean don't let him face what he did? Brandon snatched his phone back and started dialing. Fine. The company is still worth money. I'll sell it. Vanessa leaned toward him. Sell it to who? A buyer, he snapped. Someone who understands assets. He put the call on speaker. A man named Mr. Calder answered. A business broker Brandon clearly wanted to impress. Brandon's voice turned smooth again. I've acquired controlling authority over Ruby's cosmetics operation. I'm looking for a fast sale. There was a pause. Then Mr. Calder said, the old operating company, yes. Brandon said, another pause, longer this time. That entity doesn't own the brand, Mr. Calder said. It doesn't own the formulas, trademarks, retail contracts, or intellectual property. From what I can see, it's a logistics shell with liabilities attached. Brandon froze. I reached over and ended the call. Vanessa stood up so fast her chair nearly tipped. You told me we were getting the company. Brandon pointed at me. She hid it. I protected it, I said. Then I opened the last section of the folder. And one more thing. Clara, my attorney, has already documented the altered paperwork Brandon used to secure his separate bridge loan. That went to the authorities this morning. Vanessa looked at Brandon like she had never seen him before. You signed a personal guarantee. Didn't you? She asked. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Richard's face turned gray. Margaret covered her mouth. Vanessa backed away from Brandon as if his failure had a smell, and I sat there, calm for the first time in my life, watching the people who had always called me selfish finally meet the cost of their own greed. By Christmas, Brandon and Vanessa were bankrupt. Vanessa left first, taking what was left of her pride and never looking back. Brandon was under investigation for altered paperwork and financial fraud. Richard's accounts were frozen while investigators reviewed the loan, the payments, and the bills he thought no one would ever connect. Margaret called me every morning. I never answered. A week before Christmas, I mailed Richard a cashier's check for $5,000, the same amount he once called his gift to my business. Inside the envelope, I wrote only 3 words, paid in full, on Christmas Eve. My house was warm again, not performative warm, real warm, pine from the tree, cinnamon from the kitchen, laughter from people who had stood beside me when there was nothing glamorous to stand beside. Maya, my head of product, brought homemade cookies. Clara, my attorney, raised a glass and said, "To peace that was earned." I looked around that room and understood something I wish I had learned sooner. Blood can explain where you came from. It does not get to decide where you stay. So if you've ever had to protect yourself from the people who were supposed to protect you, I need you to know this. You are not cruel for having boundaries. You are not selfish for choosing peace. And you are not alone. If this story hit something real in you, share your story in the comments and subscribe, because some truths deserve to be heard.